I did not have a coat when they put me out. It was the 14th of March, 1879, and the wind off the Kansas plain came low and straight and carried grit that stung the back of your hands, and I stood at the edge of my Uncle Croft's property with a flour sack of clothes and my father's tin cup tied to it by its handle. And I watched the door of the house I'd grown up in, close without ceremony. I was 15 years old. I'd been indoors that house the morning my father was buried, and I had come indoors again to bury him a second time, this time by my uncle's word. And now I was outside in the wind with my hands going numb and a long, flat country around me in every direction. What I did not understand that morning, standing on that frozen road with the grit in my teeth, was that my father had already left me everything I would need. I only had to find where he had put it. I want you to stay with this a moment before I go on, because what follows is not a story about luck or about a girl who found something pretty in the ground. It is a story about what a dead man's hands can still build, long after the man is gone, if the hands he shaped kept working. If you have ever been told that what you know does not amount to anything, I think you will understand why I am still talking about it, 40 years on. Stay close. Croft Halsey was my father's younger brother, and he had come out from Indiana when my father took sick the second winter, drawn by the prospect of the homestead acreage, and by a confidence in his own judgment that I had never seen tested by anything harder than a dry summer. My father, Eli Halsey, had run a repair and salvage circuit across 5 counties for 11 years before he filed on the quarter section outside Greer's Crossing, and he had not stopped repairing things after he filed. He fixed wagon axles and tin roofs and plow shanks for neighbors at cost, and sometimes for nothing. And he kept a leather ledger of what he had done and what it had taken and what had held, because he said that a thing which held once would hold again if you understood why it held the first time. He was not a large man, and he was not a wealthy man, and the homestead was not proving easy, but he knew how to look at a thing that was broken and see what it wanted, and that knowledge was as real to him as land. He tried to give it to me the same way he had received it, which was slowly, through the hands first and the words after, and I had been his apprentice and his helper from the time I was 7 years old. He died in November of 1878 of a lung sickness that had been building since the previous winter, and Croft arrived in January and surveyed the property and the debts and my mother's grave marker out by the creek cut, and decided the quarter section was worth keeping, and I was not. He was not cruel about it. That was one of the things I came to understand later, that the people who write your life off do not usually shout when they do it. They speak in flat, decided sentences, the way you tell someone the weather. I can manage the acreage better without the cost of keeping you, he said. You are not my blood to feed. He had a cousin in Greer's Crossing who might take me on as a house girl if I asked, he said, and he would give me a month's provisions in the flour sack. I took the sack and the tin cup, and I did not ask the cousin anything, because I had been watching Croft's face when he said it, and I understood the offer was a formality. I walked 2 miles east of the homestead before the cold persuaded me to stop walking and think. There was a creek there, the shallow one my father had called the Cut for its steep-sided banks, and the willows along it were bare and stiff, and the ice in the shallows had not fully gone. I sat on the bank and I ate one of the biscuits from the sack, and I thought about what I had and what I needed. I had my father's tin cup and a small folding knife he had given me, and the clothes in the sack. I had what he had taught me. I did not have a roof. The bank of the Cut was high and dry on its south-facing side, maybe 8 feet of clay earth above the waterline, cut back sharply in an old flood, and then left to settle into a kind of shelf. I had sheltered there with my father once in a spring rain, and I remembered how still the air was against that wall, and how much of the cold it blocked. I walked the bank for half a mile, looking, the way he had taught me to look at something before touching it. And then, in a place where the willows grew thick and the bank curved inward, I found the wagon. It was buried to its hubs in the clay of the bank, half swallowed by a decade of silting and root growth, and its canvas cover had rotted off long since, and its boards had gone gray and soft. But the iron was still good. The wheel rims, the hubcaps, the brake rod, the single-tree chains. And underneath the rotted boards, wrapped in oilcloth that had held against the clay, were my father's tools. His joiner's planes, 4 of them, from the big trying plane down to the small block. His set of augers in their roll of canvas. His draw knife and his spoke shave, and his cold chisels and his ball-peen hammer, and his small bellows and his fire brick, and his punches and his drifts, and a coil of iron rod, and a stack of flat bar stock, gone orange with surface rust but sound underneath. He had cached them here, I realized. The winter he was injured on the road, the winter before I was born, intending to come back for them when he was well enough to work the circuit again. He had never been well enough. He had been well enough for everything else, for the homestead and the ledger and the repair work out of his barn, and for teaching me. But he had never gone back to the buried wagon, and now it was mine. I did not cry. I put my hand on the oilcloth and held it there for a moment, the way you hold a door you're not sure you should open. And then I opened it. I understood what he had left me. It was not land, and it was not money, and it was not a cousin's house in Greer's Crossing. It was 11 years of knowing how to make iron and wood do what you needed them to do. It was the hands that had taught my hands, still present in every edge, and every wrapped handle, and every worn, smooth plainsole. It was enough. Hester Cale was a widow of 62 who kept a small farm half a mile north of the cut, a woman with a dry manner and a practical streak that ran all the way through her like a vein of hard rock in soft country. She had known my father from his circuit days, had hired him twice to repair her barn roof, and she arrived at the creek bank on my 3rd day there, with a tin of salt pork and a directness I was grateful for. She asked me what I was doing, and I told her. She looked at the tools and at the bank, and at what I had already started digging, and she was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had a corner of her barn I could sleep in, and I could take my meals with her if I helped with the chickens. She did not say anything about the digging being unusual, or the tools being too heavy for a girl, or what the town would think. Hester Cale was not a woman who spent much time on what the town would think. I dug the forge room into the south face of the cut over 3 weeks, working through frost and mud, shoring the walls with timbers I salvaged from the wagon bed and from deadfall along the creek. I built a low stone chimney using creek flatstones and clay mortar, angled to draw up and out through the bank top, where it would barely show. I set the fire brick and fashioned a small hearth from the wagon's brake housing. I leveled a workbench from the wagon's axle boards, which were elm and had stayed sound at their hearts, and I hung the tools on iron pegs I hammered out of the flat bar stock. By mid-April, I had a forge room 6 feet wide and 9 feet deep with a clay-tamped floor, and a roof of timber and sod 2 feet thick, and a door of wagon board planking hung on its original iron pintles. It was low and dark, and it smelled of clay and iron and old smoke. But when the door was closed and the fire was lit, it was warm. And warmth on the Kansas plain in March is not a small thing. It is the only argument that matters. The forge room took me 3 weeks of mornings and evenings to fit out properly. And I want you to understand what that work felt like, because it was not the work of a person who had been given a good situation. It was the work of a person who had been handed a single thread and was knitting from it as fast as her hands could go. I cleaned the rust from the tool blades with creek sand and a strip of leather, working each one until the gray showed through and the edge held light. The joiner's planes I reflattened on a piece of creek sandstone, taking a thin pass at a time, testing each sole against a straight willow branch I had dried over the forge fire and trued by hand. My father had taught me this when I was 10, kneeling beside me on a plank floor in a man's barn, his hands over mine, telling me that a plane that is not flat makes nothing flat, and a thing that begins wrong cannot finish right, no matter how careful you are afterward. I heard his voice clearly in those mornings, the particular cadence of it, patient and precise, and I was grateful and grieved in equal measure, the two feelings so tightly wound together that I could not have told you where one ended and the other began. I went into Greer's Crossing for the first time in late April to buy charcoal and a sack of flour, and I walked past the store where Aldous Fenn kept his counter and his opinions in roughly equal measure. Fenn was the kind of man who had never been wrong in public, who had grown up knowing the right way to do a thing, and had spent 40 years being confirmed in that knowledge by the deference of people who needed something from him. He was town commissioner. He ran the only dry goods store between Greer's Crossing and the county seat, and he stood on his porch in all weather, the way a post stands, as though the act of standing there was itself a contribution to the town's welfare. He watched me walk past with my flour sack and said to the two men with him, loud enough to carry, "That's the Halsey girl, the one digging herself a burrow down in the cut. Tinker's burrow, they're calling it." He said it with a mild, private satisfaction, the way you comment on something mildly foolish that is not your problem. The two men nodded. I kept walking. I did not answer him then, and I did not answer him later, because my father had taught me that a principle proved in iron speaks louder than a principle argued in words, and because I had work to do. The forge was running by May. I repaired plowshares and wagon hardware for neighbors at the same prices my father had charged, fair and low, and I kept his ledger method, noting what I had done and what it had taken and what had held. Hester lent me her mule, Dob, to carry work back and forth, and by summer I had a small, steady trade. Wren found me in June, a stray with dark brown fur and calm eyes, who wandered out of the willow scrub one morning and sat down beside the forge door as though she had an appointment, and she became mine that simply without discussion. In July, I began the work that would, later, matter most, though I did not know then that it would matter most. I had been thinking about what my father said about a thing that held, and I had been thinking about the storms. I had seen 3 bad ones since I was small, seen them come up out of the southwest in the afternoon with their green light and their silence before the sound, and I had been thinking about what Hester's barn cellar was and what it was not. It was a root cellar, dug 6 feet and roofed with plank, good enough for potatoes and not much else. The roof planks would not hold a direct hit, and the door was flat to the ground and opened the wrong way for the wind that came with a bad storm. I told Hester what I thought needed to change, and she listened with her particular quality of attention, which was complete and without impatience, and she said to do what seemed right. I dug the cellar out to 9 feet, reshored the walls with timber frames I mortised and tenoned at the corners the way my father had shown me for anything that had to take a lateral load, set the frames in clay-packed post pockets sunk another 2 feet below the floor. I re-roofed it with a double layer of 2-inch plank, spiked with the iron I had drawn out and shaped on the forge, then a layer of tamped clay 2 feet deep on top of that, then sod. I re-hung the door on the downwind side of the entry trench, heavy planking with iron strap hinges and a drawbar of iron rod, so that the wind pressure of a bad storm would press the door shut rather than tear it open. The entry trench itself I shored and angled, so that anyone coming in had to step down and turn, breaking the direct pressure of any flying matter. When Ruth Moran came to see the finished cellar with her father Vest, she stood at the entry trench and looked at the door and at the angled approach, and she asked me why it was set at that particular angle and not straight. I told her what my father had told me because there was no better way to say it. I said that a storm's killing force is direct, that it comes at you in a line, and anything that stands directly in that line will be tested past its strength. But anything that turns the force even a little, redirects it slightly, bleeds some of it away before the full weight arrives, can hold against what would otherwise destroy it. You do not fight the whole force, I said. You change its direction before it reaches you. Ves Moran listened with his hat in his hands and said nothing for a moment, and then said that sounded about right. I did not tell him where I had learned it, because my father had learned it from someone before him, and that person from someone before that. And the inheritance of a true principle does not begin with the person who taught it to you. It only passes through them. I did not invent any of this. My father had described the principle to me once, sitting in the wagon after we had looked at a root cellar that had failed in a spring storm. He said the cellar had failed because it was built to keep out the cold, and cold comes from below. But a storm comes from above and beside, and the structure had to be built for what was actually coming. You build for the force you will actually face, he said. Not the force you faced last time. That was the whole of it. I just built it the way he said. Word got around the way word gets around in small places. Not like news, but like water finding its level. The Deacon family on the North Road asked me to look at their cellar after they heard about Hester's, and I spent a week that August rebuilding it on the same principles, and they paid me with a cord of wood and a side of bacon. The Prentice family after that, and the Moran family. And by the end of that first full summer, I had reinforced 4 cellars in the country around Greer's Crossing. And Aldous Fenn had heard about all of them. He voiced his view at the Church Harvest Social in September of 1879, standing near the cider table with his wife and 3 of the deacons. And he was not shouting, which was worse. He said that Eli Halsey's girl had set herself up as an engineer on the strength of having dug herself a tinker's burrow in a creek bank, and that the county did not lack for men who could look at a cellar, and that it was a peculiar thing when a child without property or schooling began advising families with both on how to keep their houses. He said this with the careful mildness of a man who does not need to raise his voice to be heard. And several people nodded, and a few of the women near me moved slightly away. And I stood with my cider cup, and I felt the particular cold of being talked about as though you were not present, the way wind comes under a door you thought you had sealed. Hester was beside me, and she put one hand briefly on my arm. No words, just the pressure of her hand. It was enough. There was one more instance, in the spring of 1881, not 6 weeks before the storms. I was coming up the cut road with Wren and a bundle of iron rod on Dobbs' back, and Fenn was standing with 2 men at the road's edge near his fence line, and he watched me pass and said to them, with that same idle certainty, that the girl with the tinker's burrow was still at it, that he supposed she would keep digging until she reached China, or the county took notice of the nuisance. The 2 men laughed a little, the way men laugh at a thing that does not concern them. Wren looked at Fenn as we passed, the way a calm dog looks at something that smells wrong, without alarm, simply noting it, and I did not stop walking. I want you to hold what I felt in that moment, because the feeling matters more than the events. It was not rage and it was not despair, though I'd known both in that year. It was something quieter, more like the feeling of a level that is perfectly set, a stillness at the center that the motion around it cannot reach. I had built 4 cellars that would hold. Fenn had built nothing. The plane did not care what either of us said about it. The storms would come when they came, and they would ask the only question that mattered, and the answer would be in the timber, and the clay, and the ironwork, and not in anything said at a church social in September. If you have ever stood in a place that was built right and felt that stillness, you know what I mean. If you are close to this story and wondering whether I am right about any of it, I think you already know the answer. I built 2 more cellars that winter, working when the ground allowed, and I kept the forge going through the cold months, repairing what needed repairing. Wren slept by the forge, and Hester brought supper down the bank path twice a week, and the winter passed the way winters pass on the plain, slowly and with great weight, one gray day pressing down on the next, until you have learned to carry gray as a natural condition. I turned 17 in February of 1881. There were evenings in that second winter when the cold was deep enough to make the creek stones crack, and the willows stood as white as bone in the frost, and I sat in the forge room with my ledger on my knee, and the fire low and Wren's weight against my boot, and I thought about what my father would have made of where I had ended up. In the bank of the creek he had named the cut, living off his tools, keeping his ledger, building the same things he would have built. I thought he would not have been surprised. He had always said that the ground you end up on is not always the ground you plan for, but the knowledge you carry works the same on any ground, and if the knowledge is sound, the ground will tell you eventually. He had not told me he was going to leave me that knowledge instead of a house and a parcel, but he had left me nothing else, and I had come to understand that this was not an accident. He had given me the only thing he was sure of. I turned 17 in February of 1881. I had been living in the creek bank for nearly 2 years. I had reinforced 6 cellars in the county, 3 of them at no charge to families who could not pay. I had repaired probably 200 pieces of farm hardware. I had saved every cent I was owed, and I had nearly enough for a parcel of land on the east side of the cut, a parcel no one else wanted because it flooded in wet springs and the soil was heavy with clay. I wanted it because the clay was good for mortar and because the floodplain grew willow and cottonwood for timber and because it was mine, as nowhere else yet was mine. I had applied to the county land office, and Silas Prout, the agent, had come out twice to look at the parcel and at what I had built, and at the ledger I kept in my father's manor. And he was a quiet man with a habit of writing things down in his own small notebook that I noticed but did not then understand. The spring of 1881 came in wet and warm, the kind of spring that made the grass grow 3 weeks early and put a flush of green across the plain that looked generous and felt uneasy, the way a too warm January feels uneasy, like a debt coming due. The wind shifted in the first week of May, and on the morning of the 9th, I went out to the bank top with my coffee and watched the sky in the southwest and felt something in the air that I had felt twice before. That particular stillness that is not peace but pressure. The world holding its breath before the next sentence. I went back to the forge room and I moved the tools to their high pegs, and I wrapped the ledger in its oilcloth. I went to Hester's and told her I thought she should put her chickens in the barn and come with me to the cellar. She looked at the sky and she did the same thing I had seen her do with every decision, which was to set aside everything that was not the question in front of her. And she said she would be there by noon. By noon, I had 7 people in Hester's cellar. Word had traveled, or instinct had, the way a field of birds rises all at once without a signal anyone can name. The Deacon family came with their 3 children. Old Vess Moran came with his daughter Ruth. Hester brought her 2 laying hens in a basket and set them in the corner where they sat, with their particular dignity, and did not make a sound. Wren went to the far corner and lay down on the old feed sack I had put there for her, and watched the door with her calm brown eyes. I drew the iron bar across the door, and we waited. The first storm passed north of us 1/2 mile, and we heard it as a sound like a freight wagon dragged across a stone floor, low and continuous and without end. Then it ended. We waited another hour, Vess Moran leading a quiet prayer that no one interrupted, and then I lifted the bar and opened the door a hand's width and looked. The sky was the color of old pewter and the air smelled of broken wood and turned earth. I could see Hester's chicken coop was gone, a clean circle of bare ground where it had stood. 3 of the willow trees along the creek were down. The barn was standing. I closed the door and said to wait. The second storm came in the night of the 10th, moving slower than the first, and we heard it building from a long way off. The Prentice family arrived at the cellar door at 9 in the evening, 4 of them, and then, at 9:30, Aldous Fenn. He came alone, without his wife, walking the road from town in the dark, with a lantern that the wind was already trying to tear from his hand, and he stood at the head of the entry trench and called down. I lifted the bar and opened the door. He came down the steps and turned into the cellar and looked at the 11 of us in the lamplight and at the timber framing and the iron strapwork and the double plank roof above his head. And there was a moment in which no one said anything, a moment that lasted long enough to have its own weight, the way a poured measure of something heavy settles before it is still. Then Fenn said, quiet and without performance, "You built it the right way." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Outside, the second storm struck Greer's Crossing. When we came out in the morning of the 11th, the town had taken the count of what it had lost. 9 structures gone or gutted, among them the frame addition Fenn had put on his store the previous year, the roof of the schoolhouse, and the grain barn on the Croft homestead, 2 miles west, the one my uncle had been so pleased with. 2 people in the county had been killed, a man in a farmhouse south of town whose cellar had not been reinforced and whose root cellar door had been of the old flat-set kind, opening into the wind. The road through Greer's Crossing was laid with timber and broken plank and a long scar of bare earth where the second storm had walked, and the people who came out of houses and barns and whatever shelter they had found stood in the street and looked at it with the particular silence of people who have been reminded once more what the plain is and what they are on it. 11 people had slept in Hester Cale's cellar, and 11 people came out of it. The Deacon children sat on the entry trench steps and ate biscuits from a cloth Hester produced from her apron pocket. Vess Moran shook my hand with both of his, which were large and calloused and trembled slightly, not from cold. Ruth Moran cried without sound, looking at the sky, which by morning had gone a clean pale blue as though nothing had happened. Wren came out last, stepping past the door frame with her quiet step, and sat beside me in the early light. I put my hand on her head and stood there for a moment in the sun with the smell of broken wood on the air. And I was 17 years old, and I had 11 people alive behind me, and I thought of my father with a specific and complete clarity. The way you think of a person when you have just done the thing they taught you to do, and there is no one left to tell. Fenn was there for all of it. He did not make a speech. He was a man who had found suddenly that the landscape had changed under his feet, and he was doing what sensible men do in that situation, which is look carefully at where each step lands before setting his weight. He watched what I did that morning, which was check the cellar framing and the door hardware, and make a list in the ledger of what would need attention before the next storm season. And he watched the way you watch a thing you are trying to learn, not the way you watch a thing you already know. Silas Prout came out from the county seat 3 days after the storms to survey the damage, and he came to Hester's cellar with his notebook, and he spent 2 hours examining the framing and the door and the entry trench, and he asked me questions about the timber joinery and the iron hardware and the roof construction. And I answered in the plain way my father had answered questions about his work, with what it was and why it was that way and where the principle came from, sourcing it to him and to the ledger and to the creek bank forge room, where every piece of the iron had been drawn and fitted. Prout wrote it all down. He filed a county report that autumn naming the construction method after the property where it had proved itself, calling it the Kale method after Hester's farm, which was a courtesy and a justice both. He wrote in his report that the method had no single inventor, that it was assembled from older principles by a young woman named Nora Halsey of Greer's Crossing, Kansas, and that it had sheltered 11 persons through 2 severe storms without failure. Aldous Fenn began sending people to me that fall. He did not announce this or draw attention to it. He simply mentioned when someone came into his store asking about storm cellars that Nora Halsey down at the Cut had rebuilt several in the county and might be worth talking to. He said it the way he said things, matter-of-factly, as though it had always been the obvious thing to say. I did not thank him for it, and he did not ask me to. We had reached the place where 2 people who have been through something together can speak plainly without the weight of what came before crushing every sentence, and that was sufficient. I bought the parcel on the east side of the Cut in the spring of 1882. Silas Prout processed the paperwork and shook my hand across his desk and said he hoped I would keep working, that there was more need in the county than hands to meet it. I thanked him and went home along the creek bank with Wren at my heels, past the buried wagon that I had long since emptied of its tools, its old boards silvered and settling slowly back into the clay that had kept them, going back the way everything goes back eventually, and I put my hand on the iron rim of the nearest wheel as I walked past, the cold of it familiar, the surface of it worn smooth in the places where my hands had worn it smooth. And I did not stop walking. The Kale method, which was not the Kale method, but my father's method, and before that, the method of whoever had taught him, and before that, the long, slow inheritance of people who had learned to build for the force they would actually face, spread through 3 counties by 1885. It was copied imperfectly at first, as things are always copied imperfectly, people taking the visible form and missing the principle underneath, building deep enough but skimping on the timber framing, or setting the door right but using plank that was too green or iron that had not been drawn to a proper temper. A few of those failed in lesser storms, and I heard about them and said nothing except to the people who came to ask, and to those I said what my father had said, which was that you have to understand why the thing holds if you want it to hold for you. The form is the outside of the principle. The principle is what travels. By the time Silas Prout published his County Building Guide in 1891, the cellar method had been formalized and diagrammed, and the diagrams were distributed to every land agent in the district. My name was in a footnote. I had not expected more and would not have wanted it. My father's name was not there at all, because Prout did not know it belonged there, and I thought sometimes about that gap, about all the knowledge that travels without its source, arriving in new hands with no record of the hands it passed through before. The principle carries. The names fall away. That is the way of it, and it is not entirely a loss. I am an old woman now. I have been an old woman for some years without particularly noticing it, the way you do not notice the light changing in a room you have been sitting in all afternoon. I have the parcel beside the Cut, and a house that is not underground. Though I kept the forge room for 40 years, and only let it go when the timbers finally gave, and the bank caved in on a wet spring, filling it with clay, the way the clay had filled the wagon before it. Wren is long gone, as dogs go, but there have been others since her. All of them dark-coated and calm-eyed. All of them descended from the dog who came out of the willows that June morning and sat down by the forge door as though she had always been expected. The current one is named for nothing particular, which is to say she is named the way Wren was named, for what she reminded me of, a quick brown thing that moves without noise. There is a cellar in the county I have not seen in 20 years, one of the 3 I built at no charge in that first year, on the Deacon farm now passed to their son and his family, and the granddaughter of the family, a girl named Lottie who came to see me last summer, told me the cellar is still in use, that her father keeps seed in it in winter and they have sheltered in it twice in storms, that the iron bar on the door is the original one, drawn and fitted by my father's tools in the forge room in the creek bank in the summer of 1880. She had not known any of that. She held the bar every spring when they checked the hardware, and she had not known whose hands had made it. And I told her. She was quiet for a moment, the way a person is quiet when a thing they have touched 100 times becomes suddenly different without changing at all. And then she said she was glad to know it. The bar still catches the light, she said. Even after all these years, the iron still holds.